God was not silent until he was, and then the silence came. The silence of God.
Okay, I want you to picture this. Imagine for a second that you are holding the only working satellite phone in a world that is completely, totally without electricity. You're surrounded by these massive, ancient empires. Civilizations that are literally building the pyramids or sitting around debating advanced philosophy. But you, and only you, have this direct, unfiltered line to the creator of the universe. And here's the thing, it's not some quiet, static-filled connection where you're struggling to hear. It is booming. It's loud. The voice on the other end is parting seas. It's manifesting as literal pillars of fire and speaking with a volume that actually shakes the earth beneath your feet. But then, one day, the line just goes dead. Complete, staggering, deafening silence. No warning, just static. Well, welcome to This Explainer. To all of you curious learners out there tuning in, we are so incredibly glad you're here today. We're going to be taking a deeply objective, kind of forensic tour through a massive, exhaustively detailed framework known as the silence of God. Essentially, we're going to map out this vast, ancient cathedral of theological thought. Now, I want to be clear right off the bat. Our goal today isn't to endorse or debate the theology itself. Instead, we're going to act as your tour guides. We're going to walk you through the author's fascinating arguments, their definitions, and the timelines, exactly as they're presented in the source material. We're going to pop the hood, investigate the underlying mechanics of this proposed divine strategy, and answer one singular, really burning question. If the divine radio used to be so incredibly loud, why did it go dead? So here is how we're going to chart our course today. First, we'll look at the era of noise. Second, the ultimate rejection. Third, smashing the hardware. Then, in part 4, we'll examine this silent dispensation, uncover this wild, almost sci-fi-like twist in the cosmic training ground, and finally, we'll explore how this silence shatters. 2000. Just let that number sink in for a moment. For roughly 2 millennia, humanity has experienced this absolute heavy silence. And when you compare this to the physics-defying, deeply visible, completely undeniable communication of the ancient world, the contrast is completely mind-blowing, right? To understand this massive span of silent history, the source material insists that we've got to first fully grasp the mechanics of the noise itself. If we want to investigate why the radio went dead, we absolutely have to look at how that broadcasting system was built in the very first place. Which brings us right into section 1, the era of noise. According to the framework we're looking at, the incredible volume of that ancient divine communication was rooted entirely in a highly, highly exclusive covenant relationship with one specific nation, Israel. You see, this wasn't some philosophical abstraction. It wasn't a distant watchmaker deity who just wound up the clock of the universe, brushed off his hands, and walked away. Not at all. It was a hyperactive, highly visible, and very exclusive partnership. And the author is quick to point out that this wasn't because Israel was some massive, unconquerable superpower. Actually, quite the opposite. They were a band of enslaved nomads chosen out of completely sovereign love. The ancient Hebrew word the text highlights here is segula, and it's a brilliant word. It translates roughly to a peculiarly owned treasure. Think of it like a private reserve of intense, exclusive, personal value. So while the Egyptians were out there building mathematically impossible pyramids, and the Greeks were laying the absolute foundations of Western philosophy, spiritually speaking, they were out in the dark compared to Israel's VIP segula status. The text also brings in another Hebrew word, yada, which means the most intimate relational, personal acquaintance possible. God wasn't just casually observing Israel from a distance. He was micromanaging their national life, their diet, their calendar, their civil laws, in a way he simply wasn't doing with anyone else on the planet. The ultimate goal, the blueprint says, was that Israel would act as a conduit. They were supposed to be the global mediators. Basically, if you lived in the ancient world and you wanted to communicate with the Creator, you had to go through Israel. They literally held the hardware. And that hardware, it utilized a literal language of action. Look at how the framework argues the 10 plagues of Egypt. It says they weren't just random, spectacular natural disasters designed to spook a pharaoh. No, they were targeted, precise theological assassinations. Every single plague was a direct, calculated confrontation with a specific false deity. For instance, the Egyptians worshipped Hapi, the god of the Nile. So what happens? The Nile is turned to blood, effectively killing Hapi's domain of life and fertility. They worshipped Hecate, a frog-headed goddess of childbirth. So God multiplied frogs until they became a rotting, inescapable nightmare, totally mocking her domain. And the grand finale? 3 days of absolute pitch-black darkness. This directly defeated Ra, the supreme sun god. This was loud, undeniable communication, and the Egyptians would have read it exactly as it was intended. Their gods were being systematically executed on a public stage. And this level of noise? It continued for centuries. It culminated in jaw-dropping events like the prophet Elijah on Mount Carmel literally calling down fire from the sky that vaporized stones and water. It was unmistakable proof that God was actively, physically intervening in the world. So that takes us to section 2, the ultimate rejection. And this brings us to a really profound paradox in the text. Think about it. If the evidence was this overwhelmingly physical, like if you literally stood there and watched fire eat stones, how could you possibly go back to worshiping a silent piece of carved wood the very next day? Well, this entire theological framework hinges on the tragic irony of human reception. God sent prophet after prophet, operating this constantly renewed, booming stream of communication. That satellite phone was ringing off the hook. Yet the sheer volume of the noise did absolutely nothing to guarantee the obedience of the human heart. In fact, the people entrusted with the satellite phone essentially spent centuries trying to smash it to pieces. The author highlights this fascinating Hebrew word marpeh, meaning a healing or a cure, and they use it to explain this tragic irony. You see, the historical pattern of rebellion wasn't just passive drifting away. The people are dealing with a deadly plague, and instead of seeking a real cure, they're protesting outside the hospitals, demanding that the doctors only prescribe them cherry-flavored sugar pills. They literally passed laws to execute any true prophet who dared to offer the actual bitter medicine that would save them. The disease of rebellion wasn't just a phase. It was becoming institutional. It was becoming structural. And this terrifying breaking point of rebellion, it's cataloged in the ancient chronicles with one absolute chilling phrase: till there was no remedy. Now, while divine patience in this framework is described as vast, it definitely has a threshold. The accumulation of all that willful rejection completely exhausted the available cures. Mechanically speaking, no more healing was possible because the patient absolutely, stubbornly refused to take it. So this centuries-long buildup of static on the line funneled down into one massive, explosive historical focal point: the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth. The text points out that he didn't just show up to some random nation. He came to his idios. That's a Greek word meaning that which belongs uniquely and exclusively to someone. He came to his own family, his own property, and the institution willfully executed the ultimate messenger. Let's move into section 3, smashing the hardware. Now, if you just read this narrative linearly, you would probably assume the crucifixion was the absolute final straw, right? You'd think the radio went completely dead on a Friday afternoon and the 2,000 years of silence began immediately. But according to the timeline presented in the source material, that assumption is entirely wrong. In an act of what the author calls incomprehensible long suffering, God actually extended a post-resurrection encore. That period of Acts, starting at Pentecost, it wasn't some quiet dawn of a new era. It was a deafening encore of signs, wonders, and miracles. And the purpose was to definitively offer that promised earthly kingdom to Israel one final time. But how did the national leadership respond? Specifically the Sanhedrin, the Supreme Council of 70 elders who acted as the official institutional voice of the nation. They responded with escalating violence. And this all climaxed with the stoning of Stephen. It's a crazy scene. When Stephen stood before the Supreme Court, he had a vision of Christ standing at the right hand of God. Not sitting, standing. The author stresses that this posture implies military readiness. The kingdom was literally suspended on a knife's edge. And what did the Sanhedrin do? The text says they literally cried out with a loud voice and physically stopped their ears. Grown men, the absolute highest legal authority in the nation, legally and institutionally hung up the phone. They officially shut out the divine broadcast. So, because the spiritual verdict was officially sealed by the leadership, the physical dismantling of the earthly apparatus simply had to follow. Fast forward a bit to 70 AD. The Roman general Titus sieges Jerusalem. The temple catches fire, and the heat is so incredibly intense that the immense gold ornamentation melts, and it pools down deep between these massive foundation stones. To get the gold out, the Roman soldiers literally used pry bars to heave apart every single stone, fulfilling the prophecy that not one stone would be left upon another. But the author points out that the theological loss here was vastly worse than the architectural one. The entire massive system of animal sacrifices instantly ceased. Those vast genealogical scrolls that proved a priest's lineage all the way back to Aaron, reduced to ash, making it legally impossible for anyone to ever legitimately claim the priesthood again. Even the Urim and Thummim, the literal divine communication devices kept in the high priest's breastplate, they were lost forever. The hardware wasn't just broken, it was permanently smashed. Theologically, the author anchors this devastating historical moment in an ancient prophecy from Hosea, giving us this really terrifying name, Lo Ami. It translates to not my people. And the literal Hebrew is actually even more stark than that. It reads, I will not be to you. That intense, hyperactive, highly visible covenant that kicked off back at Mount Sinai was formally and publicly suspended. Now, the author is extremely careful to clarify something here. This was not a permanent cancellation. The text insists the calling of God is irrevocable, but it was a functional, operational suspension. By suspending Israel's elevated national privilege, God essentially leveled the playing field. He placed Israel in the exact same spiritual condition that the Gentile nations had been in since the very beginning. So this brings us to the exact burning question the source material raises. If the hardware is completely smashed, if the temple is a pile of rubble, the prophets are totally silent, and the playing field is completely, totally leveled, how in the world do we actually hear God? How do we survive in this newly created vacuum? Let's dive into Section 4 to find out. The silent dispensation. So the source material reveals what is honestly a massive paradigm shift. It turns out this silence we're experiencing, it isn't God retreating in anger. It's not God taking his ball and going home because humanity messed up. Not at all. The author argues it was the deliberate strategic creation of a vacuum, designed specifically to be filled by something entirely new, a period referred to as the dispensation of grace, or sometimes simply the mystery. And this brings us to an important Greek word, oikonomia, which is translated as dispensation. It literally means the administration or the stewardship of a household. Think of it like the rules of the house, how the estate is managed. And in this new, entirely unprophesied era, a divine secret that the text says was completely hidden from Moses, from David, from Isaiah, until it was finally revealed to the Apostle Paul, the rules of divine access radically changed. Just look at the profound structural shift here between the old and new systems. Under the old system, there were these incredibly strict hierarchies of access. It was based on your physical lineage, there were literal heavy curtains in the temple, there were visible miracles validating the prophets. It was essentially like an incredibly exclusive nightclub, right? Complete with heavy velvet VIP ropes and very strict bouncers checking your ID at the door. But the new system? It is defined by the Greek word pas, which means whosoever. All. Without any distinction whatsoever. The strobe lights are turned off, the VIP robes are taken down, and the front doors are thrown wide open to the street. The billionaire and the person sleeping on the sidewalk enter through the exact same door. The ground is completely, ruthlessly flat at the foot of the cross. The author makes a brilliant point here. This new inclusive entity, the body of Christ, could only have been formed in the silence. Think about it. If the loud, visible, institutional framework of Israel's dietary laws and temple feasts were still active and functioning, Gentiles would inherently be at a massive disadvantage. So the silence actually dismantled those cultural barriers. The silence acted as the great equalizer. But that still leaves a practical issue. If God isn't speaking through burning bushes anymore, how exactly does he communicate today? Well, the framework points squarely to the completed written word. The Greek words used to describe the scriptures in this era are incredibly robust. We have artios, meaning fully fitted, and exartizo, meaning outfitted with every conceivable tool needed for every possible task. It's comprehensive. So in this silent era, the written word serves as our completely equipped toolkit. It intentionally replaces the visible miracles. And the author argues this is actually an upgrade, not a downgrade. Why? Because visible miracles are psychologically dangerous. They almost always create faith in the physical benefit rather than in the actual character of God. Just remember the crowds, the exact same crowds who were totally mesmerized by Jesus multiplying the loaves and fishes for free lunch. They were the ones screaming, "Crucify him," just a few days later. Loud signs simply do not secure enduring internal moral faith.
Which brings us to section 5, and things get really interesting here. Cosmic training ground. This is where the blueprints take a turn that honestly sounds like the plot of a science fiction epic. The author introduces a staggering claim regarding the ultimate behind-the-scenes purpose of this silence. It proposes that the body of Christ, meaning the people being formed right now, during this specific silent era, has an actual, literal, trans-dimensional destiny. Let me explain. While Israel's Old Testament promises were all about physical geography, a literal earthly throne, crops, rain, the church's promises are vastly different. The framework suggests that Lucifer, before his fall, was the head of a massive administrative structure, like a literal galactic government of principalities and powers. When his ego and his pride caused him to rebel, it didn't just cause a spiritual problem, it created a massive cosmic vacancy, a power vacuum. The breathtaking assertion here is that ordinary human beings today, sitting in the quiet, are currently being trained in this era of silence to ultimately replace that vacated heavenly hierarchy. But how? By developing the exact opposite character of Lucifer. Lucifer was all about pride. He was all about self-exaltation and seeing his own glory. But believers today, we sit in the silence. We often feel like God isn't answering, but we choose to trust the written word anyway, without seeing the burning bush. It's much like Abraham trusting God for a child when it was biologically impossible. We are being rigorously trained. The silence forces us to operate in the dark. It strips away our human pride and it forces an absolute, total reliance on the grace of God. And this silent faith, it produces beings who are fundamentally, morally trustworthy with real cosmic power. So you see, the silence isn't abandonment at all. It is a deliberate, highly structured apprenticeship for eventually ruling the universe.
And finally, Section 6. The silence shatters. Because the blueprints are crystal clear on this one point. This silent training ground will not last forever. The silent dispensation has a highly precise, explosive expiration date. Right now, the only voice God is actively using is the simple gospel message. The Greek calls it dynamis, which is where we get the word dynamite. It's powerful enough to quietly reconstruct a human heart from the inside out. And while this is happening, the text says Israel is in a temporary state of spiritual blindness, a sort of divine alchemy that allows for this era of universal Gentile blessing. But the clock is ticking, and the era of silence will abruptly end with an event defined by the Greek word atomos. Now, in ancient philosophy, an atom was the smallest, most indivisible particle of matter, right? You couldn't split it. So an atomos is an unsplittable unit of time, the absolute smallest measurable fraction of a second. Literally instantaneous. The framework outlines that once the final, preordained number of individuals is reached, the church is instantly evacuated, and God's prophetic clock for Israel, the very same clock that was violently paused back in 70 AD, is suddenly, immediately unpaused. And let me tell you, it does not resume with a gentle whisper. It resumes with apocalyptic thunder. The source points to this terrifying, highly cinematic detail from the book of Revelation, Silence in Heaven, about the space of half an hour. The author provides a really chilling analysis of this specific moment, because this is no longer the benevolent training silence of grace. Not anymore. This is the ominous, heavy silence of a warrior drawing a massive, deep breath before striking a decisive, fatal blow. It is the collective intake of air by the cosmos itself, right before the full theory of divine judgment falls upon a world that stubbornly, continually rejected the quiet, easy gospel of grace. It is the ultimate cosmic speak now or forever hold your peace. When the microphone is finally turned back on, it is hooked up to a stadium sound system of pure, unmitigated judgment. But thankfully, the architect's blueprint does not end on destruction. The final act of this massive drama is the millennial kingdom. the thunder of that judgment actually paves the way for the ultimate physical fulfillment of every single promise ever made to Israel. The surviving remnant will experience a profound, broken-hearted repentance. And that terrible name we talked about earlier, Lo Ami, not my people, it will be completely, totally reversed. The text points to a literal, physical restoration where Christ rules directly from Jerusalem. As the ancient prophet Isaiah declared, the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. It's not just going to be pockets of knowledge here and there. It will be complete, inescapable global saturation. The silence will be definitively, permanently over. So what is the crucial point we take away from this massive, intricate architectural framework? It's this. The silence of God is not an accident. It is absolutely not indifference, and it is not abandonment. According to this blueprint, it leveled human pride. It completely dismantled cultural barriers. And it serves right now as a redemptively pregnant training ground for a future cosmic administration. And I want to leave you with this final, really provocative thought. We spend so much of our days staring at the static, right? Begging for a burning bush or just a neon sign to prove there's a signal connecting us to some larger meaning. But if the architect of this text is right, then silence isn't a dropped call you need to panic about. It is a highly deliberate crucible. It is the universe holding its breath, waiting to see exactly what kind of person you will choose to become when the training wheels of visible miracles are finally taken off. So the next time you sit in complete heavy silence, don't ask why the radio is dead. Ask yourself, what is this quiet trying to build in me? Keep asking those hard questions, keep looking for the signal in the static, and thank you so much for joining us on this explainer. We'll catch you next time.